On the day we got married, my husband's childhood sweetheart threatened to jump to her death. He ignored her threats and went ahead with the wedding. But when she did jump, he realized how he really felt and fell madly in love with her. He forced me to help him to her, and he went ahead with the wedding. And my husband's childhood sweetheart threatened to jump to her death. He ignored her threats and went ahead with the wedding. He realized how he really felt and fell madly in love with her. He forced me to help him, and eventually I lost the baby in my womb. On the day I had the abortion, I asked him for a divorce. He threatened to use my family against me to make me stay with him. I wasted my life for him. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on our wedding day. Tell Nara that if she wants to die, she's welcome to do so, but there's no way I'm going to comfort her. Cancel. Lennox's cold voice jolted me awake, and as I looked up, I saw my reflection in the mirror. Wearing a pristine white wedding gown, I realized that I had been reborn. Behind me, Hansel stood with a serious expression on his face, his tone impatient and sharp. This time I'm going to push Hansel to Nara. I want to be the one who forces him to convert. I grabbed Hansel's sleeve gently and said, "Hansel, you should go comfort Nara." He stared at me in disbelief. After all, I used to lose my temper whenever Nara interrupted our dates. In my eyes, she had been a manipulative, spoiled, entitled brat who thought the world revolved around her. She always acted like a lovesick teenager, and if they even exchanged a word, I would blow up. Hence, it was only natural that Hansel was caught off guard by my sudden change. Seeing my serious expression, Hansel frowned and asked, "You want me to leave you on our wedding day to see another woman? Amber, do you realize what the tabloids will say about you?" I laughed internally. While the gossip would not be the death of me, he certainly would. I pretended to be understanding and replied, "Hansel, I don't care what others say, as long as your love for me is genuine." I even added we can also postpone our wedding. After all, you and Nara go way back. If something happened to her, you'd regret it. And I'd feel guilty too. Besides, this is about saving a life. I'd pause the wedding to save anyone, even a stranger. My words earned me murmurs of approval from the guests. Even Hansel's parents, who had always looked down on me, seemed impressed. Hansel pulled me into a tight embrace and kissed my forehead, his voice filled with emotion. "Amber, I knew I chose the right person. Wait for me. I'll make this quick. After I save Nara, we'll resume the wedding." I nodded and gave him a gentle push. "Now go. Saving her is more important." Without hesitation, I turned and ran upstairs to the rooftop. I watched his retreating figure, clutching my wedding dress so tightly to maintain my composure. In my previous life, Hansel resented me for taking him away from Nara. In this life, I would set him free, wishing him and his beloved Nara a happily ever after. To sell the act, I stood silently on the stage in my heavy gown, waiting for him. For a full hour, the guests whispered among themselves, torn between curiosity about the rooftop drama and pity for my selfless patience. Eventually, Hansel returned, but not alone. Walking beside him was Nora, dressed in a wedding gown of her own. I had almost forgotten a crucial detail. In our previous life, Nora had jumped off the roof while wearing her wedding gown. Now she clung to Hansel's arm with a triumphant smile, her eyes burning with challenge as she looked at me. The crowd erupted in discussions, looking at me with nothing but sympathy in their eyes. Hansel looked torn as he turned to me, his voice hesitant. "Amber, Nara told me that she's loved me for years and has only one wish to have a wedding with me. She promises not to bother us anymore if I agree. So would you let her have today's wedding?" Hansel's words sent shockwaves through the grand ballroom. No one expected that after I kindly let him interrupt our wedding to save another woman, he would return with such an absurd request. Even Mrs. Lennox, who had never approved of me, found her son's behavior disgraceful. "This is ridiculous, Hansel. Marriage isn't a game. How could you switch brides at the last minute?" Meanwhile, Mr. Lennox frowned disapprovingly, but remained silent. It was obvious that he was planning something. Hansel looked at me guiltily and said, "Amber, this is my fault. I'll make it up to you someday." The guests whispered among themselves, some offering sympathetic glances, while others mocked my generosity, saying I had brought this upon myself. I maintained my composure, pretending to be deeply hurt yet dignified. "For the Lennox family's sake," I said with tears in my eyes, "it's all right." When I chose to save Miss Sullivan, I decided to prioritize her feelings above all else. Nora immediately protested, "Hansel saved me, not you. I would have jumped if he hadn't agreed to marry me today. What does this have to do with you?" Her words prompted those who already sympathized with me to speak up in my defense. The crowd discussed the situation. Nora learned that I had urged Hansel to save her. She was embarrassed, but it did not last long. She quickly raised her chin and haughtily replied, "If Hansel didn't want to save me, no amount of persuasion would have worked. The truth is, he still has feelings for me." Hansel exploded with anger at being exposed. "Nora, if it weren't for our family's close ties, I wouldn't have bothered with you at all. Amber has suffered enough because of you. If you keep trying to drive us apart, you can go right back to that rooftop." Nora's eyes reddened with frustration. However, she knew that no one would take her side, so she lowered her head and softened her tone. "I'm sorry, Hansel. I just love you so much. Since Amber is willing to give up the wedding, let's proceed quickly. We shouldn't keep the guests waiting." Hansel hesitated and looked at me. I smiled and left the stage to change in the dressing room. Before I reached it, music had already started playing, and I could hear Nora's passionate vows echoing through the hall. After I removed my makeup and changed into my regular clothes, a hotel staff member rushed in to tell me there was a commotion in the front hall. I hurried there. I found Hansel pinning my nephew Ezra Baldwin to the ground. Nora stood nearby, her dress stained with what looked like juice, as she stamped her foot and screamed, "Beat that worthless piece of trash!" I rushed forward in fury, trying to pull Hansel's arm away while shouting, "Hansel, let him go!" Ezra saw me and called out with tear-filled eyes, "Amber, he was my sister, Lorna." Baldwin's only child in my previous life, he had been Hansel's leverage against me. Later, feeling guilty about what happened to me, Ezra jumped from a high rise, ending his life at a very young age. I had fallen into depression afterward and died shortly from illness. When I saw my beloved nephew alive and well in front of me, I could not stop my tears from falling. Hansel ignored my protests. The jerk of his arm, he flung me to the ground. Pain shot through my lower abdomen and my body went cold. It was then I remembered I had already been pregnant at this point in my last life. Hansel froze when he saw me on the ground. He rushed over to help me, but I pushed him away, my eyes burning with anger. I pushed him away with tears in my eyes as Ezra ran to my side. He helped me up while asking worriedly, "Amber, are you okay?" I nodded and hugged him, saying, "I'm fine." In truth, the pain in my abdomen was unbearable, and I had a feeling I might lose the baby. Nonetheless, this aligned with my wishes. Although I felt sorry for the child, I did not want it to be born into a loveless environment or carry the blood of such a despicable person. While I was lost in thought, Nora's mother stormed over, fuming with rage. "Amber, your nephew drenched Nora with juice. If Hansel hadn't stepped in to discipline him, the Sylvans wouldn't have let this go so easily, Amber." "I only disciplined Ezra to appease the Sylvans," Hansel quickly explained. "Don't worry," I held back. "I wouldn't really hurt him." I glared at him through gritted teeth. Ezra's lip was bleeding and his face was swollen, yet Hansel still had the audacity to call that holding back. Under my resentful gaze, Hansel lowered his head, knowing he was in the wrong. I turned to Mrs. Sullivan and said sarcastically, "Mrs. Sullivan, your daughter was on the rooftop threatening suicide half an hour ago, and I'm the one who convinced my groom to save her. By that logic, I'd say I'm her lifesaver. Ezra rushed here from school for my wedding, only to find the bride had been switched. He thought his aunt was being mistreated and couldn't help but throw his drink at the new bride to defend my honor." I gave her a sharp look and continued, "So tell me, as her lifesaver, shouldn't we just call this even?" Mrs. Sullivan frowned, clearly wanting to retort, but the weight of the guests' gazes silenced her. She huffed and stepped aside without saying another word. With Ezra's support, I slowly stood up. Hansel noticed my complexion and asked worriedly, "Amber, why do you look so pale?" I ignored him and turned to Ezra, whispering, "Call an ambulance." Ezra immediately pulled out his phone to make the call. Hansel was clearly startled and asked, "What's going on? Why call an ambulance? I barely pushed you. It can't be that serious, right?" "She's probably just trying to make you worry about her," Nara mocked. Hansel frowned and said, "Is that true, Amber? I don't like this kind of manipulative trick." Ezra wanted to fight him, but I held him back and said, "Help me to the entrance." As Ezra supported me, I clutched my stomach and walked slowly through the pain toward the hotel entrance. Hansel tried to stop us, but suddenly someone yelled, "Miss Sullivan fainted!" Then he immediately turned his attention to Nara, scooping her up and shouting, "To the hospital!" I turned to watch him carry her through the crowd, his face etched with concern. My chest ached as I thought bitterly. Even during our most loving days, his choice was always Nara. If I had realized this sooner in my previous life, perhaps I would not have met such a tragic end. "Amber, you still have me." Ezra comforted me. "Don't be sad. I'll always be here for you." His words warmed my heart, and I smiled, saying, "Don't worry, I'm not sad." Ezra was not convinced. She declared angrily, "When I grow up, I won't let anyone hurt you ever again." By then, we had reached the hotel entrance. Since the hospital was nearby, the ambulance arrived quickly. Before I could speak, Mrs. Sullivan rushed out screaming, "Doctor, save my daughter! She's fainted!" Then someone roughly pushed me aside. If Ezra had not been holding me, I would have fallen hard. I looked up angrily to see Hansel carrying Nora out. When he saw me, he showed no remorse and instead said matter-of-factly, "Amber, you just had a small fall. But Nora's different. She's unconscious. She needs immediate medical attention. Let her take the ambulance and I'll have my driver take you home to rest." The pain in my abdomen was getting worse, and I shook my head. "No, I can't. I need to go to the hospital. I knew Nara was faking, and there was no way I would risk my own life." Mrs. Sullivan stormed up to me and slapped me hard across the face. "You wretch! Who are you to compete with my precious daughter?" When Ezra tried to defend me, security guards pinned him down. I collapsed to the ground, trembling in pain, and looked to Hansel for help. He avoided my gaze and said, "Mrs. Sullivan is just worried about Nara. Besides, Amber, this is about someone's life. You shouldn't be jealous at a time like this." Others criticized me, saying my earlier gesture of letting Hansel save Nara was just for show. With that, Hansel carried Nara past me and quickly boarded the ambulance. Before leaving, he looked at me and said, "Amber, you've always been kind. You'll understand my choice, right?" Without waiting for my answer, he climbed into the vehicle. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, I screamed in anger, "Hansel, you're a complete bastard!" The next moment, someone pointed at my legs in horror and shouted, "Blood! She's bleeding everywhere!"